So the engine's out of the Turbo 400, getting some oil leaks cleaned up over the winter. I took the oil pan off and look what I found. What is that? Looks like the spring out of a pen or something, but I don't know how that would have got into the oil pan. The only other springs in the motor are in the starter clutch. Could it possibly be from there? So I'd never had a starter clutch apart before, but I knew there were springs inside of it. And when it's all installed together, there's three little rollers that are spring loaded, and that's how the starter clutch works. So I had this old starter clutch. I'd never had one apart before, actually, so I pulled it apart. I would have thought the springs would have been much heavier than that, but no, they aren't. And sure enough, there's the culprit. There's the actual spring. So, good news, bad news. I found the spring in the bottom of the oil pan. The motor had been running without any issues, so that means that all the parts that came out fell to the bottom somewhere without damaging any of the gears, the transmission, or anything like that. But when I pulled the oil pan, the spring was the only thing I found. I didn't find either of these other two parts. So they either went out of the pan when I drained the oil before I pulled the motor, or they are still lurking somewhere in the engine. I don't see how the spring could have come out while these parts were still in place. I just don't see how that would be possible. So one has to assume that these two parts, the little cap and the roller, are either in the bottom of the engine somewhere, or they went out with the oil. So I guess that's the next task, is to pull the starter clutch out of the bike and see what exactly I've got. It may be a bit of a blessing in disguise too, because when I pulled these ones out, these are rubber, supposedly. They are as hard as a rock. Of course, these bikes are 50 years old now, so I guess that's not to be entirely unexpected. These rubbers are still available, at least off of eBay, new old stock. I don't know if they still make them or not, but they are available new old stock. They're not cheap. They're about $8.50 US a piece, and there is 8 of them, so you're talking Canadian, almost probably $100, maybe even more with shipping. But if the clutch is coming out of the bike, I think I'll probably, well, I'll certainly assess those, and if they are hard, rock hard like that, I'll replace them too. So I was quite dreading this, because I was thinking originally that the cases would have to get split to get out the starter clutch. This is the actual starter clutch assembly. There's the primary drive chain that comes off the crankshaft and drives this jack shaft, which drives the oil pump, and then goes into the other casing here and drives the outer clutch hub. And this big gear is the gear that the starter motor drives. And so as you can see, it'll spin freely one way, and then, but it won't go the other way. The clutch engages. So it's free to spin normally, but as soon as the starter motor fires, and it turns it the opposite direction. So I was quite kind of deflated, thinking I was going to have to split the cases to get at this. But then I realized that, and I remembered, I guess I haven't put one of these motors together for a few years, but I remembered this shaft actually comes out through the side of the engine. So I just have to remove the clutch cover. There's a big bolt on the side, and then that holds it in place, and then the shaft gets extracted one way or the other. I can't not remember which way. I believe the shaft is able to be extracted this way out the side of the engine. I'll have to look that up in a manual. So there's the shaft, and there's the nut that needs to come off, and then that gear needs to come off. Well, I wasn't sure if I could do that with the clutch in place, but I'd have to say no. It looks like I have to take the clutch off first to get that gear off of there too. So I guess that's the next order of business. It looks like the whole clutch will have to come off probably. It looks like the whole outer basket needs to come off. That's a bit of a pain in the ass, but it is what it is. So these M6 bolts need to be loosened just a little bit at a time so that you take the pressure off them easily. So when I'm working on stuff like this, I also like to just keep everything in one container, and then regardless of whether I get back to reassembling it in a few days or a few weeks, everything is in one place. That's the clutch release plate with the bearing, with the release bearing in the center of it. Clutch springs. Now we've got to knock down the tab washer and get that lock nut off. So that nut has 4 female indentations in it, and you need a tool with 4 prongs to fit. So I made a tool that fits in there. Turns out I didn't need the reducer. The 3/8 inch drive had enough torque to get that off. Now the inner basket can come out, and I can probably pull all the plates off at the same time with it. There's a nice sheen sleeve in there that you got to watch it you don't lose either. So there's our gear shift mechanism. And there's our nut that we have to get off of here. So I'll probably have to go out and find an impact socket for that. Once I've got the starter gear out, there's a little flange back here that I pushed on, and that allowed the bearing to come out. It's just a slip fit in the cases. There's the little flange. Now I should be able to pull the shaft out. Maybe I do have to split the cases. I'm going to have a look at that old clutch and see exactly how it goes together. Okay, so the shaft actually goes out that way. So I had to remove the oil pump, which was easy. It's only 4 bolts and it just comes off. The tricky part now is going to be getting the shaft out without anything coming apart and dropping into the motor. It's not the end of the world, I guess, if it does. I've got the motor on a rotating stand. If something falls in, I should be able to flip it upside down and get the parts out, but I would rather avoid that if at all possible. So the primary chain is still wrapped around part of the hub. And it's going to stay that way, I think. So there we've got the shaft basically out. Trying to separate that clutch without losing anything. Okay, good news, bad news kind of situation. I got it out. You can see the damage. You can see the outer clutch casing is cracked right across there. The good news is all the parts were still in place. All 3 rollers and the 3 caps were still in position, so that's why I didn't find anything else other than the spring in the bottom of the oil pan. Now I have no idea how that spring could have possibly got out of there without the cap going with it. The only way I can see it possibly happening is when they drill the cavity for the spring and the cap, you can see that they seal that drilling with a steel plug. You know, they drill from the outside in, then they press that plug in there for the spring to sit against. And so that one's in place, that one's in place. That one, there, you probably can't see it, but there's actually a hole in the middle of it as if it snapped the end of the cap off or something. And that hole, I'm not sure if the spring is small enough to go out of that hole or not, possibly. So that's possibly how the spring shot out of there. I don't know. So, you know, luckily I have another one that's in better shape. The casing on that one has a little bit of a dent in it, which I can hammer that out. I can smooth that out. Interestingly, I thought these things were made out of phosphor bronze. Because of the color of them, they have this bronze color to them. But I think what that is, I think it's a copper coating. And initially I couldn't figure out why they would copper coat that. But after a while I started thinking that maybe that is part of a hardening technique. If this casing, parts of it are hardened and parts of it aren't, they would use the copper coating to create pockets or areas that would not harden. But I can see down inside, those areas don't have any copper on them. They are probably hardened. So I'm guessing that that's kind of a part of a manufacturing process. Pretty interesting. So it is what it is. I've got new rubbers on order. So once they get here, I can put everything back together.